Hello, dear friends, and welcome to our podcast dedicated to sight reading through the lens of historically informed performance practice. And today we have a guest. What is your name? Could you please introduce yourself?
I'm Johannes Keller. I'm a keyboard player, harpsichordist mainly.
And what are you doing here in Schola?
I teach the subject tuning and intonation, and I'm a researcher in the field of let's call it the ugly name microtonality in the 16th century.
Why ugly name?
Because it's not really about microtonality. I sort of dislike that expression because it brings out the quality of micro, so as if it was the goal to create very small intervals, which probably was not the only or the main motivation, but it was more a side effect, an outcome, because one of the goals might have been to create very much in tune intervals, and what is produced by that, reaching that goal, are very small intervals, but it's not about creating small intervals. So microtonality is a bit misleading in that sense, although it's correct technically. Martin Kirnbauer introduced the term Vieltönigkeit. That is very difficult to translate into English. It's like many-toned music. So it's more about the plurality of pitches than the size of small intervals.
And what is the initial idea, the original idea of having all those small or large intervals that are not usual?
There are many answers to that question, so I try to give you one, maybe more later. I would say the main thing to blame is polyphony, because as long as you use intervals as a melodic phenomena, so something that happens in one voice, for example, one human who is singing produces intervals within the sung line. As long as you are living in that kind of a world, you can have any kind of interval definition and it will work. As soon as you add more voices and you observe what happens between all those voices and you have an expectation towards these intervals that they are of a particular type of or size, you cannot combine anything. So if you have specific melodic intervals that should produce specific intervals between the voices, it gets very complicated. And this is what happened in the Western understanding of polyphony. The fact that by singing thirds and fifths and whole tones, let me put it this way, the expectation that by singing these intervals, you produce these intervals between the voices as consonances and dissonances. This is not realistic. It doesn't work mathematically. So there are problems that are created by that. And one of the solutions to these problems is to have many slightly different interval sizes, many different types, many different sizes of fifths or thirds. And then you choose according to the context and you make it work. Or you say, I'm going to use a compromised version of a fifth or a third, and I'm going to accept that this compromised version is the only one I have available, and I make music with that. And both solutions left their traces in music history, so both are well documented and used for very different aesthetic goals.
So it would be worth mentioning now that this is a specific problem for keyboard instruments, or a great problem for keyboard instruments. I mean, for all instruments, of course. But in the keyboard, we often talk about temperament, wohltemperierte Klavier, and, mean tone and everything. So we are talking right now about an instrument of yours that you have in your possession. Can you tell us about Vicentino and this instrument a little bit?
Yeah, Nicola Vicentino published a book in 1555 where he describes not only a keyboard instrument, the archicembalo and the arciorgano, but also a practice around it, how to produce music and perform music that uses these instruments. And a couple of years ago, in the context of a research project at the Musikakademie Basel, we reconstructed these instruments for the first time, actually, after, let's say, the 17th century, where they disappeared. And now we have those instruments available as musical instruments and as research tools. And this allows us to explore these documents and these scores that are still around using this instrument. And you mentioned that it's particularly a keyboard-related problem that I mentioned. I think it's independent of the whether you sing it or play it with melodic instruments or play it with keyboard instruments. The keyboard instruments are just the poor ones that cannot help but show us the problems, because we have only a limited number of keys and pitches per octave available, normally 12. And it turns out that 12 is a very smart choice, because there are a lot of symmetries available, but also it forces us to accept compromises that go quite far. And obviously in the 16th, early 17th century, these compromises were not that easily accepted. And that's why the limitation of the keyboard instruments was painfully obvious to the musicians at the time, and they tried alternative solutions to tempered systems, such as the wohltemperierte system or equal temperament that we know from pianos nowadays. So the Arciorgano is one of those attempts to create an interval system, a tuning system that can do so much more than what keyboard instruments normally can do.
And do you think it comes from hearing purity in vocal music, or it comes from wanting to achieve purity in vocal music?
Impossible question to answer. I mean, there are several ways to see this instrument. So what it was historically as an artifact. One way is to see it as a crazy invention that some weird person came up with in the 16th century, and no one really got it. No one was interested, and it was treated as a Sackgasse der Musikgeschichte, one of the famous quotes, one-way dead-end street of music history. So it died because it was not successful. That's sort of an evolutionary way of looking at it. The other way is to look at it is to see in it an attempt to document, to describe, to materialize something that was around at the time, for example, in vocal groups or wind bands. And of course, it's too complicated to document by writing about it in numbers or language. So maybe this artifact, this machine, is documenting something that happened anyways. So that, in that sense, I could agree with you. Vicentino observed many things, a great variety of intonation approaches, and tried to materialize, to crystallize that into a keyboard instrument. In that sense, it's not really a keyboard instrument. It's more like a music machine that can reproduce very complex intonation structures and make them available also for study and to train, to learn, because you cannot really train something that is never really there. So as soon as you create a stable reference system, like a deluxe tuning machine, you can start learning it, training it, giving names to all these many, many different intervals. Vicentino is naming well over 40 different interval identities. And in one of his organ tunings, you can count more than 140 different interval sizes that are then mapped to these interval identities in very complex ways. So it's way, way beyond what we are used to manage mentally, coming from the background of modern contemporary musicians' education.
Wow, that's like a parallel universe.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about Vicentino's theory and about all those tunings and modes that he created?
Of course, it's a bottomless pit. The rabbit hole goes very deep, and I'm far from having reached the end. So I'm really just discovering and observing for years now, actually, and reading his book, roughly 300 pages of dense information over and over again. I just keep discovering new aspects. So what I'm explaining now, or what I describe now, is just a momentary reflection on my own understanding of it. So I already mentioned this perfection of intervals, so that you can have a pure fifth and third and obviously octave available at all times in all kinds of constellations. But that's just one side of it. The other side is a strong motivation to be more expressive with the contemporary music. And he creates this expressivity by reintroducing concepts of ancient Greek music into the contemporary practice of his time. He's not trying to reconstruct ancient music. That's not his goal. He very much appreciates the contemporary music for its polyphony and the many consonances that are available within that polyphony. So for him, I think modern music is polyphonic, 3 to 7, 8 voices, polyphonic music using the thirds and sixths as consonant intervals, which was sort of a kind of a new thing in his time, because in the 15th century you could argue that the thirds weren't consonant yet. They were unstable, part of a Pythagorean tuning system where the major thirds are much larger than pure and much larger what we use today, and therefore a very unstable identity, an unstable sonic experience. But he's clearly talking about thirds as a consonant thing. But as such, this system is quite limited of what you can do. You can use whole tones, one specific type of semitone, the semitone between E and F or B and C, and transpositions of that, and minor thirds, major thirds, fourths and fifths, and that's pretty much it. And he diagnosed a great lack of variety in that, and he criticizes the contemporary music for being so much reduced in its expressive potential based on the limitation of different interval identities. So he went to the Greek texts and tried to come up with sort of a hybrid system, like a Frankenstein of a music theory, bridging the contemporary practice and Greek ingredients. And the main ingredient that he reintegrated is the idea of the three genera, Tongeschlechter, namely diatonic, chromatic, and harmonic. We still use those terms, but in a different context. So he basically creates a genesis of a music system that is quite traditional. He starts with tetrachords, so structures of a fourth, the interval of a fourth, filled with 2 additional degrees in its center. So we have, for example, the fourth BE, to use note names. You could fill that with B, C, D, E. So we have a semitone B, E, B, C, and 2 whole tones C, D, D, E. That's a diatonic tetrachord. By stacking 2 of these tetrachords, he can create a scale of an octave consisting of 2 sub-fourths. This gives him sort of a scale in a modern sense, spanning an octave, and within that octave he can locate the modes, so the modal scales, starting on D for the first and second mode, so the authentic and plagal Dorian mode is based on D, within that octave scale that consists of 2 stacked tetrachords. And then he can also define the E modes, the Phrygian modes, and the Lydian and the Mixolydian. So he comes up with 8 modes, the usual 8 modes at the time, based on these tetrachord stacking. So far, that's nothing new. That's how Renaissance music theorists describe the genesis of scales and modes. But what he does, he uses the expression of the transmutation from the diatonic genus to the chromatic one, and he goes back to the very starting point of this genesis, to the tetrachord structure itself, and he says, okay, this is the diatonic structure that we know. The chromatic structure uses two different semitones and a leftover interval that happens to have the size of the minor third, but it is a degree, it's a step, it's not the leap of a third. If we want to assign note names to that, it could be B natural, C, C sharp, and E. That's an example of a chromatic tetrachord. And there's nothing between C sharp and E. This is the grado della terza minore, the degree of the step of the minor third. And by using that tetrachord, he can stack it and create an octave scale, and he can again locate the 8 modes within that scale. So he gets a second set of 8 modes that have a different inner structure for the melodic intervals, but they are still Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, and each of them in a plagal and authentic version. So he has a parallel stream of a music genesis. And then he does it a third time for the enharmonic material. And for that, he again needs to change the inner structure of the tetrachord. And one example of an enharmonic tetrachord would be B natural dot C E. So the dot thing is the thing that he needed to invent because the normal notation system of the 16th century couldn't articulate the interval of the diesis. And the diesis is the typical melodic interval of the enharmonic genus. And it's smaller than a semitone. And there are 2 different ones of them, a minor one and a major one. And if you take the fourth as the framing interval in the tetrachord, you go from the B natural, for example, a diesis minore upwards, you reach the B natural dot, which is just a tiny bit sharper than a B natural. And then you go to the C, the interval between the B natural dot and C is a diesis maggiore, so a major diesis. It's larger than the first diesis that we created. And the leftover interval between C and E is a major third, but in the sense of a degree, of a step. There is no D available because you cannot divide that step between C and E. It's a grado incomposto. And by stacking 2 of those enharmonic fourths, tetrachords, he again creates the scale of an octave, and he can again locate the 8 modes within that scale, and by that he creates a third set of 8 modes. But these are part of the enharmonic genus. And then as an outcome of that, he creates cadence formulas, progressions, counterpoint rules, all of that for each of the 3 genesis separately. And he says that in the end, to be more expressive than normal contemporary music, the composer always has to choose one of the 3 genera and use them consciously.
So, but why ancient Greece? Because it was fashionable at that time, or is there a general idea behind inventing all these 3 genres?
I'm not sure if I can answer that question. It was certainly very fashionable and also very normal. Like since Boëthius, and that's like late ancient times, these ideas, they have always been used to build a strong fundament for a theoretical understanding of music in the Western culture. It was always around, and it was just natural to go back to that. And then, of course, there were many, many things, for example, polyphony, that was absolutely not part of that. But still there was this tendency to legitimize what we are doing by going back to the Greeks, and not only music. in many, many parts of the culture. This was architecture, for example. All kinds all the intellectual disciplines were based on ancient understanding and adapting that understanding, modernizing it, making it maybe better. And it is clearly in that line of thinking. What is special for him is that he takes it much further than anyone else. And there is a strange, maybe not strange, but it's an obvious separation between the theorists and the practitioners at the time. The theorists went really far with applying the mathematical principles of ancient music theory, but the practitioners didn't. And often I ask myself, did they ever talk to each other? Did any musician sit down with a monochord and really construct these crazily complicated systems and put them into music? Because we don't find any traces, we don't find any scores using those things. We don't find any interval names or notation systems using all those systems. But Vicentino is an outstanding exception to that, because he did put it into practice. He built these instruments. We can document at least 5 of those organs that he built. And he was traveling with them. He was very much seen and heard and discussed in the time. That there was public discussions, disputes. He even needed to pay a fine for spreading bad knowledge about music theory. He was sponsored by the most influential and rich cardinals. So he was part of world politics with his standing.
But why then his instruments didn't survive until now? I don't know, even Renaissance traversos, they survived and we can see them in museums, but sadly his Arciorgano did not.
Yeah, there are many reasons. Obviously, this idea of using or abusing keyboard instruments to do very complicated things was not successful throughout the 17th century. So the phenomena of split keys, even not in the crazy way of Vicentino, but just some split keys per octave to have D sharp and D flat to choose from, they disappeared, maybe because they were complicated to play. I'm not so convinced of that argument, because they are actually not, as it turns out. But they are complicated to handle in terms of music practice, to tune, you cannot transpose in a system like that easily. It's much more convenient to have the 2 semitones so close together that you can actually swap between them. So I think the development towards tuning systems with a closed circle of fifths, where you can have the black keys as sharps and flats at the same time, that development is very easy to understand for practical reasons and aesthetical reasons probably too. So it's certainly in that context that the practical need for Vicentino's instrument just disappeared. And who would look after an instrument that is not needed anymore? A museum, but museums didn't really exist back then. And his organs that were built out of wood, they had wooden pipes because they can keep the tuning much better than metal pipes, and they're easier to move around, and wood burns. And there's so many organs documented that had wooden pipes in the 16th and 17th centuries. And today we have 2 of them. And I'm not talking about Vicentino organs, but just normal, regular organs. There must have been thousands and thousands of instruments that just disappeared entirely. So it's not so surprising that a niche instrument such as the Arciorgano didn't survive. But it's one specific reason I cannot think of. We know that Vicentino died of the Black Plague, and his apartment, all his possessions were burned in Milano. So maybe also instruments. That would be one of the explanations.
So since we're talking about the instrument, because this is audio format, can you please describe the instrument.
The visual appearance.
Yeah, or no, but I mean, I see two keyboards, and can you just tell us a little bit about the system?
Yeah, so the reconstruction is based mainly on one piece of paper, sort of an ad, a flyer, praising the instrument, printed in 1561, probably by Vicentino himself. And he describes it in great detail. And it's basically what we see here. So we try to be really loyal to that description. So it's an organo di legno, that means wooden pipes. You see that immediately because it has a facciata, prospect, what's that in English? That is mitra shaped. So it's like a triangular shape with the longest pipe in the center. It has 5 rows of pipes. The first 3 rows are sort of sitting on top of the instrument. There is a keyboard consisting of 2 manuals, but the lower manual, all of the black keys in the lower manual are split into 2 parts, and there are 2 little keys between B and C and E and F. And the upper manual has also all the black keys split into 2 parts. And the keys are very small. The octave span is normal, a standard octave, but they're very close together, so they're very short, the white and the black keys. And it's easy to imagine that you play on both manuals at the same time. They have more like a typewriter kind of appearance than a normal organ keyboard. I don't know if you agree, but
yes,
it looks like a Lego imitation of a typewriter, maybe. There are 4 octaves available. And the case, the organ case, sort of mimics a temple ruin. So there is no roof, there's no architrave that you could expect of a Greek temple, but sort of it's weirdly cut at the sides to mimic a torso.
Is that historical? Is that in the description?
There is not in the description, but there is a coin, a medaillon, that survived with an engraved depiction of the organ and the harpsichord of Vicentino. Wow. On the other side, it's a portrait of him. And you can see that it's very weirdly shaped. Like it doesn't have the closing rooftop kind of construction that you would expect from a portable organ of the time. The design comes from an architect who specialized in Greek architecture, like ancient architecture, and he looked at that design on the coin, and he came up with that idea. Maybe it's because at the time they built a lot of ruins from scratch, following the proportion principles of Greek architecture, but not finishing them because they are ruins. So it's sort of this idea of creating an unfinished historical artifact. And that is what this organ is. It is an artifact. It's a hypothetical artifact. It's not a copy of anything. We made it up, but based on historical evidence. So in that sense, it's an sort of comparable to a newly built ruin to explore then.
Great. I love the poetics. And what are the 2 keyboards? What are the differences?
They're basically one keyboard,
yes.
Split into 2 manuals. And there are 2 tuning systems that Vicentino describes. One of them, for both of them, the lower keyboard remains the same and the upper keyboard changes the inner tuning. The lower keyboard is always tuned in a sort of a mean tone understanding. So I'm going to be quite technical now. For you tell me if it's too.
Well, also maybe we'll put some links for other content so that people who are not so familiar with tuning can educate themselves just a little bit.
So I don't hold back. I'm very technical. So it's if you look at the mean tone temperament as a chain of fifths, the chain of fifths used for the lower manual is starting at the G flat and ending 18 fifths later at the B sharp. So there are 19 pitches defined by that, 18 fifths that are tempered by a quarter comma. So the fifths are smaller than pure biquarter of a syntonic comma. This results in major thirds. So all the major thirds that can be found on the keyboard are pure. Of course, only the one that are spelled the correct way. So for major third on B natural, it's the D sharp key, and for major third below G, it's the E flat key. So you cannot use the same.
C sharp and F would not be a third. C sharp F.
No, we have an E sharp key for that. C sharp F is a diminished fourth and therefore sounds different. So the main principle of mean tone temperament in general is that any interval with a name has a unique sound. So you cannot have two different interval names sounding the same. It is possible on a piano because a C sharp F there, it sounds the same as a major third, but in mean tone temperament that's not the case. So the mapping is eindeutig, mathematical term. Yeah. And the upper keyboard is tuned in the same way, and the difference between the keyboards is in the first tuning that Vicentino describes a diesis, which is the fifth of a tone, or half the distance between C and C sharp, for example, or F and F sharp. So half the chromatic semitone. That means that there is a key that sits exactly in the center between C and C sharp. So that creates a scale, if you like. I don't like that term, but a succession of pitches ordered in according to their pitch. That starts with C, for example, then comes C upper manual, which we call C dot, then C sharp lower manual, then D flat lower manual, which is one diesis higher than C sharp, then D flat dot, D flat on the upper manual, and then finally D. So we have 5 pitches that divide a whole tone. C dot, C sharp, D flat dot, D. D is the 6th pitch above C. And so on. The whole octave can be divided in that manner. And it turns out this is basically a 5th tone scale. So each whole tone is divided into 5 equalish parts, and they are just lying in front of you.
Maybe it's the time to demonstrate the sound of the Arciorgano.
So maybe I can start with the tetrachords. So just as a illustration of that theme. So this would be a diatonic tetrachord with a normal semitone BC and a whole tone and another whole tone and a fourth as the stable interval. Then we can stack those two. So I created an octave scale, and within that octave scale I can produce all the modes. So I'm using different note names. For example, the first mode, or the second mode, and the third mode, and so on, using these octave scales. And now from the diatonic to the chromatic genus, I have to use a different fill-in for the fourths. So again, the fourth, this creates the chromatic tetrachord consisting of a large semitone, which is the same one that we use for the diatonic one, and a small semitone, and a leftover. The leftover has the size of a minor third. And now the enharmonic tetrachord would sound like this. And here I decided to have the major diesis first. It's a major diesis. It's a minor diesis. And the leftover, who sounds like a major third, but it's a step. And by stacking that, I can again create a octave species. For example, now I transpose it because I don't have all the keys in the right tuning right now, but would be an octave outcome of the stacking of the two enharmonic tetrachords. And like that, I can again define the modes and so on. And then transform it into polyphony, of course. That's what Vicentino's book is about. Yeah. So just a division of the whole tone would be, by the way, this is transposing by a whole tone, so all the note names that I'm mentioning are shifted by a tone to the normal system of today based on 440. It's for any perfect pitch people. Exactly. So this would, what I play would be a G. Hang on. It's like a scottatura for me now because I'm switching between the system. So this would be G, G dot, G sharp, A flat dot, A.
And quickly, how does it sound?
Which one was it? Yes.
Nice. Wow. Very impressive.
But the A flat dot is on a diatonic key.
Just now, because I
see.
Retuned it for the demonstration. Okay. Right now the organ is in Vicentino's second system, which is the main system that we decided to put on the organ. I can obviously change the system, but the system that is normally there when there are no modifications in place is the second system of Vicentino, which is again different than what I just described before. But what is the outcome of the system that I just demonstrated, which is using these three different types of tetrachords, is that we have many more melodic intervals available, and also strange interval concepts. They are not just versions of thirds and tones and fifths, but he created new identities that we sort of, for us, they are alien. One that I find particularly interesting is the third that is neither major nor minor. You could call it a neutral third. So if we have the major one, it's a pure major third, the minor one, it's a pure minor one. It's already quite strange to have it in its pure shape, because normally we are used to smaller minor thirds. So minor, major, and... So if you just hear that and try to decide, is it a minor or major third, right, what would you say? Just try to listen to it and ask yourself the question, is it minor, is it major?
It's neither.
Wow.
It oscillates. It's like one of those pictures where you can see two things, like an optical and you can go back and forth, just with your mind. You imagine something and then it turns. It's similar to that. And if you hear the minor one first and then this neutral one, I personally would say it has something of major, clearly. Definitely. But if you hear the major one first, it's clearly minor. It's the same key, it's the same pitch, I didn't change anything. But this is what he calls terza più di minore. And it has a very specific quality and expressivity and place in his system.
It's like the black matter of Vicentino. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Johannes. It was very enlightening, and yes, I'm shocked.
It's
Thank you, and thank you for joining us.
And can we find you or your studio, or I don't know, can people know more about the instrument somewhere online?
We have a homepage that is not very well updated, I have to admit, but you find some material there. We have a YouTube channel and a SoundCloud presence.
Oh, maybe we can
find all of that under the name of Studio 31.
Okay.
And of course you can put links.
Sure.
We will put links.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.